At 07:32 a.m. on April 12, 1945, just days before the official end of the war in Europe, a single American M4 Sherman tank emerged from a narrow forest road near the German town of Dessau, with its turret jammed, its radio destroyed, and its armor penetrated in 3 separate places. The tank was still moving. According to U.S. Army armored doctrine, that vehicle should have been abandoned hours earlier. A Sherman that lost turret traverse, suffered internal spalling, and operated without radio communication was considered combat ineffective. Remaining inside it under active threat was not recommended. Survival odds declined sharply with every additional engagement. Yet this tank did not withdraw. Instead, it rolled forward at reduced speed, crossed open ground exposed to enemy fire, and reached a small bridge over the Mulde River that American commanders had already marked as destroyed or inaccessible. The bridge was still intact. German demolition charges had failed to detonate. The tank crossed first. Behind it, infantry elements followed, using the vehicle as moving cover. Within minutes, the crossing was secured. German defenders on the far bank withdrew. A route that had been considered closed reopened just long enough for U.S. forces to advance another 6 kilometers before resistance collapsed entirely. In after-action reports, the crossing is mentioned briefly. The bridge is listed as captured intact. No reference is made to the condition of the lead vehicle. No explanation is offered for why a disabled tank was allowed to proceed at the front of the column. From a doctrinal perspective, the outcome makes little sense. A tank that could not rotate its turret could not respond effectively to threats from multiple directions. Without radio communication, it could not coordinate with infantry or other vehicles. Internal damage increased the risk of catastrophic failure at any moment. And yet, the tank crossed the bridge, survived contact, and altered the movement of forces in a sector where planners had already assumed delay. What followed was not a dramatic breakthrough or a celebrated action. It was a narrow window, measured in minutes, during which the assumptions on both sides failed to align with reality. The war was almost over. But on that morning, doctrine still mattered. And this outcome did not fit it. The area east of Dessau in April 1945 was a transitional battlefield. German forces were retreating, but not uniformly. Some units withdrew rapidly. Others held ground to protect crossings, supply routes, or simply to delay advancing Allied formations long enough for civilians and stragglers to move west. Terrain in the sector consisted of mixed woodland, shallow rolling fields, and river crossings that became natural choke points. Roads were narrow and often bordered by trees or low embankments. Visibility varied sharply depending on elevation and foliage. In some areas, a vehicle could be seen from over a kilometer away. In others, contact occurred at less than 50 meters. Weather conditions were stable but deceptive. Spring rain had softened ground near rivers and low fields, limiting off-road movement for heavy vehicles. Sherman tanks could maneuver reliably on roads, but risked bogging down if they deviated too far. German defenders exploited this by focusing fire on road-bound armor near bridges and crossings. The bridge over the Mulde River was one such point. It was narrow, concrete reinforced, and flanked by shallow banks that offered little cover. Demolition charges had been placed, but not yet detonated. German infantry and light anti-tank weapons covered the approaches, relying on the assumption that American armor would not attempt a crossing under uncertain conditions. From the American side, the crossing was considered optional but desirable. Alternative routes existed, but required detours that would slow the advance. Intelligence suggested German resistance was weakening, but local strength near the river was unclear. The decision to test the crossing depended heavily on the condition and availability of lead elements. The disabled Sherman approached under these conditions: restricted maneuver space, uncertain enemy presence, and limited time before German forces could react decisively. The tank commander was Staff Sergeant Michael R. Hanley, age 26, from Toledo, Ohio. Before the war, Hanley worked as a dock laborer along the Maumee River, loading and unloading freight under conditions that rewarded caution and punished haste. Equipment failures were common. Work continued anyway. Hanley enlisted in 1942 and transferred to armored units after initial training. He was not known for aggressiveness. His evaluations described him as steady, conservative, and attentive to vehicle condition. He spent more time inspecting components than rehearsing tactics. Inside the tank, Hanley understood limitations. He tracked engine behavior by sound. He noticed subtle changes in vibration. He treated mechanical failure as inevitable rather than exceptional. This mindset shaped how he approached command. The rest of the crew reflected similar backgrounds: men accustomed to labor, machinery, and fatigue, rather than abstract maneuver doctrine. None were trained to operate a tank with a disabled turret. None expected to be in that position days before the war's end. When the turret jammed earlier that morning after a near miss from anti-tank fire, Hanley assessed the damage quickly. The gun could still fire forward. Rotation was gone. Internal damage was manageable. For now. What mattered was whether the tank could still move, still intimidate, and still occupy space the enemy did not want to contest. That assessment, shaped long before the war by experience with broken equipment and incomplete systems, would define what followed. The moment approaching the bridge was not framed as a final act or a defining stand. It was framed as another problem to manage, one more decision made under conditions where waiting offered no advantage, and that decision would place a disabled tank at the front of a crossing it was never designed to lead. U.S. armored doctrine in 1945 was built around coordination. Tanks advanced with infantry support. Radios linked vehicles into maneuvering elements. Turrets provided 360-degree fire coverage, allowing crews to respond rapidly to threats from multiple directions. A single tank was not intended to operate independently for long, and a damaged tank was expected to withdraw rather than lead. In theory, the system reduced risk. In practice, it depended on components functioning as designed. The Sherman tank's effectiveness relied on mobility, communication, and firepower working together. Mobility allowed repositioning under threat. Communication ensured coordination with infantry and other armor. Firepower, especially turret traverse, provided the flexibility to engage targets quickly. Remove any one of these elements, and the system degraded sharply. For Hanley's tank, two elements were already gone. The radio had been destroyed by spall when a near miss struck the hull. The turret ring had warped just enough to jam rotation completely. The main gun could still fire forward, but the ability to respond to flanking threats was gone. From a doctrinal perspective, the vehicle was combat ineffective. The system's guidance was clear. A tank in that condition should fall back, link up with maintenance or recovery elements, and avoid further engagement. Leading an advance, especially toward a river crossing, violated those assumptions. But doctrine also assumed alternatives. It assumed intact vehicles were available to take the lead. It assumed time existed to reorganize. It assumed enemy resistance could be bypassed without consequence. Near Dessau, those assumptions were no longer reliable. The column approaching the Mulde River had limited armored strength at the front. German resistance was uneven and unpredictable. Waiting risked allowing defenders time to detonate demolition charges or reinforce the crossing. The system had not failed completely. It was incomplete, and incomplete systems forced commanders at the lowest level to reinterpret intent rather than follow instruction verbatim. Hanley understood the doctrine. He also understood its boundaries. The system was designed to minimize risk, not eliminate it. When conditions changed faster than the system could adapt, the responsibility to act shifted downward. In that gap between what doctrine prescribed and what circumstances allowed, the disabled Sherman remained present, mobile, and intimidating. Qualities that doctrine did not quantify, but that still mattered on the ground. The decision to move forward occurred without ceremony. As the column paused short of the river, reports filtered in. Uncertain enemy strength, no confirmed demolition, sporadic small arms fire. Waiting offered clarity, but also risk. Every minute increased the chance that German engineers would complete their work. Hanley faced two options. Option 1 was withdrawal. He could signal the column to halt, back his tank out of the lead position, and allow another vehicle to move forward if available. This aligned with doctrine and reduced personal risk. It also delayed the advance and exposed following infantry to uncertainty without armored presence at the crossing. Option 2 was to continue forward. The tank could still move. The gun could still fire forward. Its silhouette and mass could still deter infantry. By advancing, Hanley could test the bridge quickly and force the enemy to react under time pressure. The risks were obvious. If anti-tank fire appeared from the flank, the turret could not respond. If the bridge collapsed, the tank would be lost. If the engine failed, the crew would be trapped at the most exposed point. Hanley chose to advance. The decision was not framed as courage or sacrifice. It was framed as sequence. The tank was already at the front. It could still fulfill a limited function. That function, occupying space and forcing reaction, was time-sensitive. Once the tank began moving, reversal became difficult. Infantry followed closely, using the vehicle's bulk as cover. The column compressed behind it. The crossing became a commitment rather than an option. The system did not authorize this move. It did not explicitly forbid it either. The decision existed in the margins, where doctrine stopped providing answers and reality demanded one anyway. Survival during the crossing depended on reducing exposure rather than eliminating threat. Hanley maintained steady speed, avoiding sudden acceleration that could stall the engine or throw tracks on softened ground. The tank's forward arc was kept aligned with the bridge entrance, minimizing the risk of encountering threats outside the gun's limited coverage. Inside the turret, the crew adjusted roles. Observation responsibilities shifted to compensate for lost traverse. Crew members leaned out of hatches despite risk, scanning flanks and calling out movement. Communication inside the tank became verbal and immediate, replacing radio coordination that no longer existed. The gun was kept loaded with high-explosive rounds rather than armor-piercing. German infantry, not armor, posed the primary threat near the crossing. The first shot needed to disrupt movement, not penetrate steel. Ammunition selection reflected that assessment. As the tank rolled onto the bridge, Hanley resisted the instinct to stop and assess. Stopping increased vulnerability. Movement reduced the window for aimed fire and delayed detonation decisions on the enemy side. The tank crossed in one continuous motion, engine straining but responsive. Small arms fire struck the hull as the tank reached mid-span. The sound was unmistakable but non-lethal. The crew ignored it. Responding would have required turret movement they did not have. Survival depended on continuing forward. Once across, the tank pivoted slowly to cover the exit point, using hull movement rather than turret rotation. Infantry followed and spread out, securing immediate ground. German defenders withdrew rather than press the engagement against an armored presence that appeared more capable than it actually was. The mechanics of survival were not heroic. They were procedural. Maintain movement. Limit angles. Force decisions onto the enemy. Accept vulnerability rather than amplify it through hesitation. By the time the crew allowed themselves to assess damage, the bridge was already behind them, and the moment that mattered most had passed. The cost of the crossing became apparent almost immediately after the tank cleared the far bank. The engine temperature spiked and required careful throttle management to prevent seizure. The suspension groaned under uneven load as the vehicle maneuvered off the bridge approach. Inside the hull, the smell of burned insulation lingered, a reminder that internal damage had not been resolved, only postponed. The crew's physical condition reflected the strain. Hours spent braced inside a damaged vehicle had tightened muscles and dulled reaction. Minor cuts from spall and jagged metal went untreated. Ears rang from concussive noise. Hands shook not from fear, but from sustained tension released too quickly once the immediate danger passed. Ammunition counts were reassessed and found to be lower than expected. Several rounds had been damaged by vibration and were set aside. The main gun remained functional, but only within its narrow forward arc. The tank could intimidate, but it could not dominate. That limitation shaped every movement that followed. Infantry casualties during the crossing were light, but the psychological toll was evident. Soldiers who had followed the disabled tank across the bridge understood after the fact how exposed the moment had been. Confidence did not increase. Caution did. Movement beyond the bridge slowed as units consolidated and checked flanks that the tank could not cover. The tank itself was reclassified informally. It was no longer a spearhead asset. It became a mobile obstacle, useful for presence, deterrence, and limited fire support, but no longer trusted for decisive engagement. Recovery crews were requested, but none were immediately available. The advance continued without pause. What had been gained was time and access. What had been lost was margin. The tank remained operational, but only just. The crew understood that the next engagement could not be managed the same way. Survival had depended on sequence and surprise, advantages that could not be relied upon again. As the column advanced beyond the Mulde River, German resistance diminished rapidly. Units withdrew or surrendered in small groups. The crossing became one of many points along a collapsing front where assumptions failed to align with outcomes. In official records, the bridge was logged as captured intact. The advance was recorded as uninterrupted. No special notation was made regarding the condition of the lead tank. The system absorbed the event as a successful action consistent with momentum, not as an exception that required examination. Maintenance teams eventually reached Hanley's vehicle and confirmed what the crew already knew. The turret ring damage was severe. Full repair would require depot-level work. The tank was withdrawn from frontline duty days later, not because of the crossing, but because the war's tempo made replacement easier than repair. No doctrinal revisions followed. Armored manuals remained unchanged. The system did not adapt to account for disabled tanks leading advances, nor did it need to. The circumstances that made the decision necessary were already passing. Among the soldiers who witnessed the crossing, the incident became a reference rather than a lesson, a reminder that systems function until they don't, and that when they stop, outcomes depend on how much initiative remains at the lowest levels. Hanley returned to routine duties briefly before the war ended. His tank was replaced. The crew dispersed. The moment that had defined the crossing dissolved into larger narratives of collapse and victory. The bridge near Dessau still spans the Mulde River, reinforced and widened over decades of civilian use. Traffic passes without pause. There is no indication that a damaged tank once crossed it under fire, nor that a brief decision altered the movement of men and equipment at a moment when timing still mattered. In official histories, the crossing is indistinguishable from dozens of others that occurred during the final weeks of the war. Its significance lies not in scale, but in sequence, in how a disabled vehicle, operating outside doctrine, remained effective long enough to shape events before the system could correct itself. The tank did not succeed because it was resilient by design, nor because its crew ignored risk. It succeeded because risk was managed deliberately, moment by moment, when waiting would have surrendered the only advantage left. If you value carefully researched stories like this, quiet, factual, and grounded in how war actually unfolds, consider subscribing to the channel to support our team and help preserve these histories.